So I think it's around 3 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started, because I like to start things on time. Hello, my name is Anne Renee Reeser, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. So welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's presentation. The Dole Institute Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students like myself, and we're committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, and we assist in programs like today's event. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. I believe that there are also note cards on the table that if you want to write comments after you leave. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones, and after the presentation, we will have time for audience question and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come around with a mic and you can speak into the microphone. But please just ask one brief question. And now, please welcome Dr. James Wilbanks.
Thanks for coming. It's good to see all of you. Many of the same faces come each time. This is the 9th in our series of 10 lectures on World War II. Today our presenter will be Dr. Greg Hospodar, who's been a member of our department at Fort Leavenworth, which we all have a lot of free times on our hands now thanks to the U.S. government. And I'll let you read his bio rather than take up the time. So without further ado, Greg's going to talk to us about Sicily. Please, sir.
Thanks. Well, thanks for coming today. I played the music because at least if the rest of this talk disappoints you, at least there was some good music to begin with. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll see if my clicker's going to decide to work. Yeah. Can we turn the lights down? It's customary to begin with kind of a joke. And this is mine. Ran across this back in 2011. If you notice what's for sale there, you can buy anything on the internet. I put in a $38 bid for a British aircraft carrier, which apparently you could do. Okay, it was available. It was in stock. You could add it to your wish list, so I recommend that. So you take a look around. And anyway, I didn't win, needless to say. I'll start with a couple anecdotes too. Because one of the goals for this is maybe to inform you a little bit, but it's also to entertain you. And I'm not quite sure why. I'm going to work this a little bit differently so the slides don't slide ahead. The fella up there on the right is Colonel James Gavin. James Gavin was at that point a regimental commander in the 82nd Airborne Division, which did its first combat drop into Sicily. The man on his left-hand side had jumped into combat 2 times. In fact, he was more experienced doing combat jumps. He jumped into North Africa with an independent paratroop battalion during the landings in Operation Torch. Interestingly, his name is Beaver Thompson, and he was a reporter for a Chicago newspaper. He jumped out of an airplane by the time he's interviewing here. This is on July 12th, after the 82nd has fought one of its major fights. They've got a street named after it at Fort Bragg at Piazza Ridge. Beaver Thompson had jumped 2 times, and those are the only 2 times he jumped into jump period out of an airplane. So his first jump was with a typewriter into North Africa. His second combat jump and only second parachute jump was into Sicily. I think that's kind of an interesting story. In any case, if you wonder why James Gavin looks like he's entertained by having him there, it's because he jumped out of an airplane with him. And the 82nd had kind of a hard time there. All right, we'll do this way. I know there's somebody's going to ask me about this because how many people ever have seen the movie Patton? Yes, right. So what about George Patton and the slapping incidents? And again, this won't be a whole talk about anecdotes, but I'll at least throw this out. George Patton slapped 2 soldiers. In fact, in one incident, he actually pulled his pistol out. He was so angry. Both of the soldiers were suffering from what they called in World War I shell shock, and they had begun to give it a different name, combat anxiety or whatnot. It's the same kind of thing. Initially, when General Eisenhower found out about the incidents, he reprimanded Patton. He wasn't pleased at all with it. but he kind of wanted to keep it quiet. He didn't want to do a formal investigation. One of the soldiers later was diagnosed with malaria. He had it pretty bad, which contributed to his anxiety as well, and he's shipped out for that reason. In any case, Patton, it eventually goes public, despite the fact that Eisenhower and others wished to kind of keep this in-house, and also despite the fact that they weren't at all pleased with it. And then there's the famous scene in the movie Patton where he apologizes to the Army. He never officially did that, although he did make a tour around as he's leaving command, every one of the divisions in the Army. And I can tell you the reaction varied. In the 45th Infantry Division, which none of the soldiers were from, when he drove up, the entire division's arrayed and they cheered him. When he went to the 1st Infantry Division, the most combat experienced division in the United States Army that fought in Sicily as well as North Africa, he was met with a stony silence. So for the troops in the field, they knew what was going on. Eventually the story broke and whatnot. The end result of that, of course, is going to be that Patton is marginalized. However, his capabilities as a combat commander are recognized, and he'll show up again later in Northwest Europe. Well, I want to thank you for coming today, and welcome to Sicily. Has anybody been to Sicily here? Okay. You know, the impressions you'll get from reading some books, Carlo D'Esti's book, Bitter Victory, I made a play off the word there, says that the Sicilians are not very warm-hearted people. And I want to tell you, I want to encourage you after this talk that if you're visiting Europe and you decide to go to Sicily, you can go to many of these battlefields. They are pristine. They're not well marked, though, like they are in Normandy. On several occasions, when I've taken groups around, we've had Sicilian farmers come out and invite us in for homemade wine and things like that. So they might come out and ask you what you're doing there, but I found the Sicilians incredibly warm-hearted. The scenery there is spectacular as well. This is one of the stands in Sicily. One of the major road hubs there is a place called Enna, and it sits on top of an 1,800-foot butte. The town's built there for defensive reasons, going back really before recorded history, and this is one of the stands in which we do that. I got to thank my colleague in the back, John Curatola, who's tramped around Sicily battlefields, and any question I can't answer, ask John, he's probably right, okay? And there are a couple other folks I want to thank as well. I've tramped around battlefields with a couple people who were up at the Gregg Center at the University of New Brunswick. That's Dr. Lee Windsor and Dr. Cindy Brown. And I also have to thank CGSE and my boss, and I'm being politically correct here, for allowing us to go over there, to take soldiers around the battlefields in Sicily. If you go there, there's some spectacular views. I'm sad that these kind of get a little washed out. I don't know if there's a way we can turn the lights down any. In any case, the bottom of the photograph there is on a ridge overlooking the Catania Plain, which is where the British 8th Army was operating. And oftentimes, if you go there in the spring, for those of you who've been to Sicily in the spring, you know Mount Etna's got snow on it. This is a view going along one of the Canadian lines of advance, and they actually are going to have to take the hill town in the distance. Right there. It's really lovely country in the interior. And most tourists don't go there because you're attracted to the coast. A couple other photographs. This is in Enna as well, where that previous photograph from kind of overlooking into the distance was. And there are several Commonwealth cemeteries there that you can visit. There's also a German cemetery there as well. And it is uniformly, because we fought over such difficult terrain, mountainous terrain, it actually means that for driving around, it's just absolutely gorgeous. There's only one monument to the United States Army in Sicily. One. And I think that's a shame. This is it. It's on the house of a Sicilian farmer who was 6 years old when the invasion occurred. And the only reason it's there is because he cares. And they do have memorial services there. This is to the 82nd Airborne. It's not marked otherwise, and that would be something I hope eventually we can maybe do something to change. The Canadians actually have marked their battlefield sites in Sicily better than we have. And if you go to Sicily as well, there are throwbacks to a bygone age. Communism fell everywhere apparently but Sicily. So there you go. There's me posing in front of that. Okay, enough said. All right, what are we going to talk about today? Well, the first thing I've got to tell you is I am not going to tell you the entire history of the Sicilian campaign. It's impossible to do. There's several good books out there on it. Let me go back to the agenda slide. I better not pick this up since we are apparently randomly moving around. Let's stay there. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about some themes rather than everything. So what I'd like to do is leave time at the end. So please ask questions if there's something that you'd like to know more about. I do want to talk about the interlinking, we talk a lot about this at Fort Leavenworth, of the strategic, the operational, and the tactical levels of war as a measure of success in military operations. Because what I'm going to contend for you today is that contrary to this being a bitter victory, we actually did better than the historiography would otherwise indicate. So leads me to the second question. Is Sicily a bitter victory? Or is it something we can question? Is it really a bitter victory? And I'm on the side that says I don't think it's quite as bitter as it's been portrayed. We'll talk a little bit about what we know from the history books, and then just a little bit on some themes about what the rest of the story is. And the thing I would like you to remember throughout this talk is historians have the great benefit of hindsight. However, one of the most difficult things to do is to restore contingency. What did they know at the time? Why did they make decisions based on what they knew at the time? And I think relative to this campaign, we've varied a little bit on knowing what's going to happen in Italy later on, and that has colored our viewpoint of what actually happened in Sicily, when we understand kind of what the decision makers knew at the time. All right, what about this campaign? Well, this is kind of Sicily by the numbers. We commit about 12 divisions of ground troops there, over 4,900 aircraft, and over 3,200 naval vessels, including landing craft, are committed to the combat there in Sicily. It takes us 38 days from July 10th. I have July 9th on the previous slide because that's when the paratroopers take off. But July 10th through August 17th. Our losses, both for the Commonwealth and for the United States combined, are about 20,000 men. It is the first time that the United States has an independent army operating by itself. We had a corps operating in North Africa, so we've kind of stepped up in terms of the size of our independent operations. There are lessons that are learned there. In joint warfare, we also learn a lot about coalition warfare. And I'm going to make the argument for you today that one of the unspoken goals for the Allies in Sicily was to make sure that this British Commonwealth and U.S. coalition, which we all take for granted, didn't fail. Because this is 1943. We have not landed on Tarawa yet. We are landing in Sicily before we land on Tarawa in the Pacific. This thing could break apart. It could break apart very easily. And I think it's one of those things we think about today. How hard is it to operate in a coalition environment in places like Afghanistan? If you ask any of the soldiers that we teach, there are some caveats and some difficulties and tensions that go on. And those are there. This is very early in this relationship. All right, who do we face? Well, the Axis order of battle has 8 maneuver divisions, 4 German and 4 Italian. And there are 7 static divisions. They're not very good. These are folks sometimes that will shoot 3 times and surrender. So they don't really count quite as much. That being said, you didn't know whether they were going to shoot and stay or leave, so you still had to deploy the same way if you were in combat. There's 700 serviceable aircraft on July 10th within range of the island. And there are thousands more, and this enters into the planning, there are thousands more that could be redeployed from elsewhere into an extensive airfield network in southern Italy and out on the island in Sicily. The Germans lose approximately 20,000 men. The Italians lose a lot more. Most of that 140,000 are captured. We'll end up paroling about 36,000 soldiers as soon as we capture them on the island because we're being overwhelmed by the numbers that are turning them in. So many of the Italian soldiers aren't happy to fight. What else do they lose? they lose their coalition. So if ours emerges stronger from Sicily, the German-Italian coalition meets its demise there. That's significant loss. And they also, the Axis loses their ability to interdict the sea lines of communication that move through the Mediterranean Ocean. And this is significant because the ships that went out west, and we have logistics lines into Russia that are going through Iran, we're also sustaining the effort in places like India and Malaya and Australia by going around the southern Horn of Africa. And the calculation is that opening up the sea lines of communication so that the Germans and Italians cannot bomb ships that are moving through will be the equivalent of building something like over 300 new vessels because the travel time's shorter and you get more utility out of them. So this is kind of a major thing. They'll lose some other things as well. We all know about Normandy. Now this is what Samuel Eliot Morison, the Navy's official historian, said about the invasion of Sicily. In terms of initial assault strength on day one, the Allies put more combat power ashore in Sicily. It's bigger than any other operation in the war. And that's something we often don't know. This is a big deal. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the books to you that are out there. First of all, I would recommend two of them that you see up here. I'd recommend Carlo D'Esti's book, Bitter Victory. So listen to me, go read that, and then determine for yourself. Of course, Carlo D'Esti has 450 pages, and I have an hour. All right, remember that. I ask you to remember that, okay? And then the U.S. Army's Green Book series, Sicily and the Surrender of Italy, is actually really good too. If you get interested in the campaign, D'Esti's a better storyteller. The Green Book is a little dry, but it's the place to turn if you want the U.S. Army's perspective. Well, what generally do we know about Sicily? And if anybody here has read about it, anybody read World War II history, read a little bit about Sicily? Yeah, differ with me if you want, okay? But generally, this is the take, that the Allies won, but they were entirely too cautious. We could have won bigger. We could have had it all, okay? They tend to be leader-focused. Now, if you want to sell books, write a book about Patton or Eisenhower. And better yet, let's write about famous people behaving badly, right? And that's the kind of thing that sells books. So most of these tend to focus on the leaders at the highest end. And I think that belies now some of the other things we should consider when taking into account this campaign. Generally, we say that the Germans were brilliant, the Italians were worthless, and the Germans got away almost unscathed. Okay? We won, and certainly we learned things. So kudos to the soldier on the ground, but it wasn't everything it could have been. In other words, it's a bitter victory, because we'll confront some of those same German units on the mainland later on. And we'll talk some about that. That generally is the take that's out there. I think we make a mistake, because when you read books about Sicily, it is a campaign with a beginning, and it is a campaign with an end. We usually talk about the landings and the German and Italian counterattack. We talk about the paratroop drop. We talk about the second failed paratroop drop. We talk about the coalition issue when General Montgomery will lobby successfully to have a boundary move, thereby stealing a road against the Americans. We kind of stop there, and then there's this middle part of the campaign, at which point the Germans decide to leave and execute this brilliant delay operation, and it's over. What about the middle? Okay? The middle of the campaign is where most of the casualties take place. The middle for the Germans, for the Italians, and for the Americans and the Commonwealth troops. And there is a French battalion there too, because it's a coalition effort. Something important happened in the middle, and I think that's what kind of has been lost in the historiography. A brief kind of, and you can read that, a brief kind of outline of some key dates. It works out in the beginning. It looks like it's kind of working out well. And around July 14th, there's a major airborne fight between German paratroopers and British paratroopers at a place called Primosoli Bridge. And at that point, the initial plan, and I'll show you a map in a little while, doesn't seem to be working out so well. One key here is if your plan doesn't work out so well to begin with, do you continue to execute that plan as it's written, or do you have to try to do something else? And I'll make an argument for you today that the decision that Montgomery makes to steal this road from the Americans actually makes military sense given what he saw happening on the ground and knew at the time. Okay? The middle part of the battle, and it's here, and we don't like this word in the military, attrition. Attrition implies I put my resources against your resources, and the one with the most wins, and that's how we won in Sicily. Because we outnumber, in terms of final strength, we outnumber the Italians and the Germans on the ground about 2-to-1. So we have more stuff. We have more aircraft. We have more naval vessels. We've got more stuff. And that tends to be the story of how we won in Italy. I will tell you that when you see, and I'll show you some photographs later of the terrain, in this highly restricted mountainous terrain, 2-to-1 doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter for several reasons, and we'll talk about it. The soldiers on the ground and the combat units, both British and American, do very well there. And I think that kind of gets lost in it. My point being to you is this. We made them leave because they would have stayed on this highly defensible ground as long as they could have. Okay? Now, there is no doubt at the end the Germans execute a brilliant withdrawal. There is no doubt. And there's some question as to whether or not we could have done more. And we'll talk some about the planning. We'll talk some of that a little bit later on. The take home for you is this is a campaign with a beginning and an end. All right. Talk to you a little bit about why Sicily, okay, and what are the other options. Well, remember this. The Battle of Kursk, which involved the largest tank battles in World War II, begins on the 5th of July. We land on the 10th of July, okay? And I don't think you can read it down here, at least some of you may not be able to. The 13th of May, 1943 is when Tunisia falls. One thing to remember, that bottom date and why it's significant, is several of the combat units and the commanders that are going to be involved with landing in Sicily have something that they're else to do while the planning's going on to invade Sicily. They are fighting as the planning's going on. And this is going to affect how well the planning kind of works out. There's some other things that that do as well. Why Sicily? Well, there are a lot of other options, and I could go into them, but there's talk about going over into Greece. There's talk about landing further up the Italian boot. There's talk about going into Sardinia, okay, Corsica, setting up bomber bases and bombing Italy into submission. They settle on Sicily, and I think it's for a few reasons. One is it's a big island, which means if you're the Americans and you're worried about seeing that Italy doesn't become a suckhole for all your resources, because what we really want to do is go face to face with the Germans in Northwest Europe. This has a finite end, because there's another decision that has to be made. When Sicily falls, what next, right? If you commit to the Italian boot, you're kind of committed all the way up, all right? Or at least that's some of the thinking that goes on. The other key point there is if you look at it, it dominates the center of the Mediterranean. And as long as it's there, the Italians and Germans can place aircraft on the island and interdict that sea line of communication. There are a lot of things that recommend going to Sicily. It's often looked at as being the conservative route, okay? But I will tell you this. In Tunisia, the Germans and many Italian units fight very well, okay? What the Allies and what's in the mind of many of the senior commanders is, we can land somewhere. This is going to be a big thing. You've already seen the numbers on it. We need to win. This thing's still in doubt. If the first time we return to Europe it doesn't work, what does that mean on the home front? What does that mean to the rest of Europe who's watching what's going on? So if you can script this in a certain way to assure victory, that might be termed caution, but I'd also say, you know, one of the things is if you can reach your goals, it kind of makes sense, or at least it does to me. Well, the decision to go into Sicily is made at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. And there is a debate about whether to go into France early in 43 or to go into a Mediterranean strategy. There's been some recent scholarship that's come out that says General Marshall, the standard story is we went there and got outstaffed. In other words, the British showed up and did staff work better than us and argued us down. There's some recent scholarship that says General Marshall knew when he went there that we couldn't land in France. So he fought a rearguard action to get a commitment to France at some point while saying, okay, maybe the fallback position is doing something in the Mediterranean. The question then is going to be where to draw the line. Do you go on to the mainland of Italy? Now the worry for the Americans there is if we commit to Italy, what happens to those troops we want to build up to go into France? So we're not really committed in January 43 to making that commitment. The idea that this is a limited operation on an island appeals to us. Later on at the Trident Conference, they'll decide that there should be a follow-on operation. And we'll talk about the goals here really quick now. The first goal is Stalin screaming for help. So one goal of landing in Sicily is to draw German resources away from the Eastern Front. And it's also a political move because, again, Stalin is in this coalition against the Germans. The second goal is to knock Italy out of the war. And the top three are stated, all right? I mean, they're published. Is to knock Italy out of the war. In other words, if we can leave Italy away from it. Now, there are about 80 Italian divisions in the Italian army. Many of their best divisions are gone. They've been killed in North Africa and in the Eastern Front. But those Italians are holding places like Yugoslavia. They're in Greece. They're doing rear area security kind of missions. If they're gone, now the Germans have to replace them. And so the thought is, Italy's the weak link. If we can pull them away, that's going to mean that that's going to put even more pressure on the Germans. The Mediterranean sea lines of communication. Open up the Mediterranean. It's going to free up hundreds of cargo hulls so we can ship more stuff and not have to build those and put those resources elsewhere. The two kind of unstated goals are the home front. We already have roughly 1 million men in the Mediterranean. If we're going to wait now till 1944 to invade, how do you think the Americans at home that are suffering through rationing are going to take that? So what are we doing? We're waiting for a year and a half? And our soldiers are doing what? They're in England? So there's some thought that we actually need to use these resources. We need to be engaged, and we need to be engaged victoriously in order to maintain the home front to support the war effort. There's an image that everybody pulled together, but when you scratch the surface, I mean, there was war profiteering in America. There were other things as well. And there is vast concern. George C. Marshall says, you know, democracies don't fight 7 years' wars. He is well aware, okay, that the opinion of the American people matters greatly. And the same is true for the British as well. And I'd say another unstated goal is that the coalition of the British, the Canadians, we're trying to get the French on board. And the United States is the center of gravity for one of the centers of gravity for the effort. We're going to fight the Germans. We're going to fight the Italians. We have all these other military goals. The thing we cannot afford to lose, because it could wreck the future effort to land in Northwest Europe, is we could walk out. We could win in Sicily. We could walk out of there hating each other. And that's something that just can't happen. And I think there's a recognition on Eisenhower's part especially that one of the goals is that the coalition emerges stronger. Nothing helps like victory, but it also matters on those relationships that you develop.
Well, wasn't there also the thought that maybe if we did fail, then that Stalin and Hitler would get back together?
You know, I'll be honest with you. I'm not really familiar with that.
Well, that was in The Last Lion.
Yeah.
Manchester.
You know, I can say that from my point of view, that's not a big factor, but you know, that someone would worry about that with what's going on in the Eastern Front, that makes sense as well. What's going on in the Italian coalition? Well, this is falling apart. And one thing we see during the Sicilian campaign, we see it going on even before it is, this is an unequal partnership. And there's a conference June 19th, just before Mussolini is relieved or removed from power in Italy, in which Hitler dictates exactly what the Italians are supposed to do. And Italy finds itself on the horns of a dilemma. On one hand, the fascists have committed to this war. On the other hand, they realize that they've lost it. And there are a lot of ropes and meat hooks and other things waiting for you if you tell that to the Italian people. So they want to get out, but can they get out? And how do they find a soft place to land is one of the concerns that's going on in Italy. And I would tell you that there is the equivalent of a civil war that begins to happen within the Italian military. So if there are a lot of Italian officers who throw their hands up, one reason they're doing that in part is they realize what's going on politically within Italy itself. The Italian fortified port city of Syracuse surrenders on the second day of the invasion. Okay? Second day of the invasion. And in the American history, what it says is it says, well, that's just really an indication of the lack of Italian military effectiveness. What's not told is that the Italian officer who surrendered Syracuse won the Italian Medal of Gold, which is their equivalent of the Medal of Honor. And what does that tell you about what kind of might be in his decision making? So, you know, as we begin to peel back what's going on inside the Italian military, it kind of gives another point of view. What's amazing is that any of the Italians fought well, given what was the writing on the wall for most of them anyway. Another thing that doesn't get talked about, and you could do a whole talk on this, is stability operations and civil affairs. There are about 4 million Sicilians. And at this point, they are enemy civilians. And we have to figure out how to govern them. So what we end up doing is many of the same types of things. We call them today stability or wide area security operations behind the lines. And we're figuring out how to do it. I think Lou DeMarco talked a bit about what was going on in North Africa. This is the next evolution of it. I will tell you that the 2nd U.S. Armored Division, and this is not good terrain for tanks, and it's sent over to an area called Marsala. Okay, if you've been to Sicily, you might have visited. There's good wine there. And the BBC announces that they're just sitting there clicking their heels and drinking wine. When you get into the records for the 2nd Armored Division, they are asked to do security operations to make sure that telegraph lines and other things aren't being cut. Some Italian insurgents are shot. They're not trained for this mission, but that's what they end up doing behind the lines is security. Generally, the Sicilians welcomed, at least the Americans. They weren't too happy with a lot of the Brits. Now, you can't see that slide, I will tell you. I noticed that when we were running them up today, that there essentially are 2 plans for invading Sicily, and we'll begin to get into kind of the planning and why we go into it the way we do. There are 2 plans for invading Sicily. One is to invade, and I'm going to skip over this slide. I'll talk about it on another one. Let me get to, when we go to this map. Okay. The first plan that's pushed out is for the Americans to land up near Palermo and for the British to land down near Syracuse, which is the lower end of that arrow right there, all the way over to a little red dot that's right above me right here, an area called Gela. Now, the problem with this plan, there are a couple good things, there are a couple bad things about it. The good thing about this plan is that now it gives the Italian and the Germans, in terms of their response, they have to decide which direction they're going to go. The downside of the plan is that it's going to be spread out. Essentially, the British are going to land along the same frontage that we land 2 armies in the second plan. So we're going to be spread out, which means that a counterattack could serve to disrupt or destroy one of the landings. For the Americans, the problem is that we're going to land a few days later because we don't have enough assault shipping. So the image we have is that all we had in Sicily was a ton of things. This is all about landing craft, and we just don't have enough. We do have enough resources if we pull everything together to put the forces ashore in this area down here. And of course, there's the famous scene in Patton where Monty sketches out for Beadle Smith the plan on a mirror. Okay. It makes, to me, a bit of sense if you consider we want to make sure that we establish a firm lodgment ashore, and we're just not quite sure how many Germans are going to get committed to this fight. The problem with an amphibious landing on a continent, and even though Sicily's an island, it's only 2.5 miles across the Straits of Messina, is this. Can they reinforce faster than we can put combat power ashore? Because if that happens, and they can begin to use rail networks and whatnot to get more troops there, this could turn into a very bad thing for us. And we just don't know. Intelligence also assumes that because the Italians had fought well generally in Tunisia, when you invade Italy, how well are they going to fight? You know, the success of the invasion depends on that, and generally what tends to happen with military planners is they worst cased it and said, we have to assume they'll fight. And we have to assume they might fight better than they've ever fought before because now we're going into Italy. Now that turns out to be wrong. You know, a misguided assumption, but it's significant. Talk a little bit about this command by committee. Eisenhower sometimes gets criticized for not taking a firm grip on this operation. And the significant thing for you to understand about the command relationships in Sicily and in the Mediterranean generally is that Eisenhower serves as kind of a chairman of the board. And the chairman gets called in to deal with things when the ground commander is Deputy Alexander, okay, and the naval commander, Admiral Cunningham, and Air Marshal Tedder don't agree. But if they don't agree, Eisenhower keeps his hands off. And at this time, he's dealing with political issues, dealing with the French and trying to get them on board. And the French are always hard to deal with. Forgive me if you're French, but that's true. At least in World War II, they are. And this command structure has some issues. And the problem is you have 3 different groups. If they cooperate well, it's kind of based on the organization. The Navy and the ground forces cooperate very well. The air folks kind of show up with a plan and say, here's what we're going to do at the last minute. And that doesn't work out too well. The cooperation isn't that great. The other issue I'd point out to you as well, and it's one lesson they learned, is Eisenhower's in Algiers, Cunningham's in Malta, and Tedder's in Tunis. So you have separate, you have 3 commands planning this, but they're not co-located. So nobody can just walk across and talk to somebody. So there's a lot of flying around that has to happen. I'll talk about one thing on this slide in the interest of time. How well did Montgomery and Patton get along? Well, they're shaking hands and smiling there, right? Well, what I'll tell you about that, okay, in these command relations is sometimes we overblow it. There isn't any doubt that there was friction between them. I will tell you, if you read Montgomery's memoirs, you will search in vain for him criticizing Patton or mentioning that there was a race to Messina, which is what's in the movie Patton. Now, that doesn't mean that Patton wasn't invested in that. And one of the things that's in George S. Patton's mind and other folks' minds is, for the American Army, is this. At this point, we're not the lead player in the coalition. All right? So we have something to prove. And we feel like, and I'll show you the plan in a minute, we've been marginalized to a certain extent. So in Patton's mind, he might be racing, but a lot of this conflict doesn't make a ton of sense. In fact, Montgomery will tell Alexander that you need to support Patton's push because I am stalled in front of Catania. I mean, he actually supports turning the Americans loose because he sees for reducing the islands, this will be a good thing. I'll also tell you one other thing. Eisenhower and Alexander both get criticized for being weak combat commanders. I mean, it's an arguable point. What I will say is that if you consider that the command relationships between the Americans and the British are one of the key things, developing that, it kind of makes sense why somebody might take their hands off a little bit, okay, and not be a forceful commander. I'd say a lot of the same considerations are dealt with in places like Afghanistan tomorrow when you're, today when you're commanding multinational units. It's kind of hard to take charge with national caveats and whatnot. There are French folks there. We make an effort to make this a coalition of the willing. There's one French battalion. The Goumiers are there. They're French light infantry. They serve with the Americans. There's a ton of U.S. units, that many of which have fought in in North Africa. The ones that I might call your attention to are the patch next to the 82nd Airborne patch is the 45th Infantry Division, which is a National Guard division that's going to see its first combat in Sicily. And it is shipped from the United States. Offloads briefly, loads back up, and lands in Sicily. The same is true for the 1st Canadian, the Red Patch Division, down below. The rest of the units up there had experienced combat before, most specifically the Big Red One, which is the patch over here on the far left, which Patton specifically requested to have the hardest mission in his landing plan. But this is a big force composed of many different units. Joint operations. This is one of the first places where we really are going to be working hard on this, especially in terms of an invasion. The Air Force, how do you integrate an air plan into the ground plan? And in some ways this begins to work, and it's in Sicily that a lot of the air-ground coordination issues begin to get worked out. Previously it took about 24 hours in order to lay on an air mission in Sicily. So what you had to do was call, say I'd like this bombed, and then it went back, got approved, and then they went out and struck. The problem with that is if you need help right now, that doesn't work out too well. But that begins to evolve in Sicily as well. Talk just briefly about the plan that they end up with and choosing. It's this conservative plan, which is to land in the southeastern corner of the island in force, and really to land enough force that if one division fails, there's enough troops there that we can compensate for that. The British land on the eastern side, the Americans land on the western side. The toughest job was here in the center where the 1st Infantry Division, if you can see that, is going to land. But the idea is to establish a firm lodgment. And this is what the 15th Army Group Plan says. Establish a firm lodgment ashore, and here's the next order, and reduce the island. They don't really spell out exactly how that's going to happen. Generally, it's understood that the main effort's going to be with the British on the eastern side, moving up the coastline to the Straits of Messina, and that the Americans will serve as a flank guard. And that rankles many of the Americans who feel like they're being treated as kind of second-class citizens. This slide, the point here is this planning for this happens fast. This isn't Normandy. And the reason I want, what's being depicted on this slide are the maps that were available during the campaign. Do you see a big area in the middle? So the detailed maps, 125 scale, the kind of maps you'd like to use to call artillery, are available for very limited portions of the island. And they have a map company that's traveling with them, but they cannot produce maps fast enough. So you have the biggest fight the United States Army will fight in Sicily at Troina. They're calling in maps over they're calling in artillery fire on 1 over 100,000 maps. So these are zoomed out, covering, big scale maps, which causes some issues because how closely do you rely on this large scale map? And they're old Italian maps that have just been reprinted and we put English on top of them. And when you see something like this, that there's a big area in the center there where you only see a white box, so that means the map's this big, that might mean that we kind of laid this on quick because one of the first requirements is we need some good maps in order to be able to do military operations here. But we had to go. The thought is we need to follow up the momentum of the loss in North Africa or Tunisgrad. The terrain in Sicily is tough. Most of it in orange there is what we might call highly restrictive or at least restrictive terrain. Okay? So there's going to be, if the enemy defends, there's no quick way to get them out. There are no really high-speed avenues of advance, and I think that's significant for us to remember as we look at.
What is the distance from? Can you give us a scale?
Roughly, it's roughly 300 miles on a side, 250, 300 miles on a side, the island is. So about 250. Okay? It's a big island. And we land down here in the southeast corner. Okay? Now, the key to everything is this top area right here, the Straits of Messina. All right? And what we realize is once Messina is taken, if you can see where it's that top arrow up there, essentially anybody left on the island that isn't a friend of ours is going to have to surrender. All right? In order to execute the plan as it exists, generally, naval planning said that what you've got to do is seize ports because that's the only way you can sustain your troops ashore. The American Army is going to land and have access to very few ports, and we're going to begin to do an experimental method of logistics, which is to supply them over the beaches. Just some photographs to kind of give you an impression of how many, the scale of what we're talking about there. But this is the way, at least until we take Palermo, that almost all American supplies, they come right over the beaches. You're used to seeing that in photographs in Normandy, but we didn't know it would work in Sicily. And the key is this new experimental vehicle called the Duck. It's going to be one of the keys. And it turns out to work brilliantly. But again, we don't know how well it's going to work. And that kind of enters into how aggressive you want to be with what plan you're going to give to the 7th Army. Do you give the Americans a big plan if you're not real sure how well you're going to be able to sustain their combat power ashore? Turns out to work out pretty well. Oh, another view of the difficult terrain. Oh, look like we're moving in the wrong direction there. This is some of the ground that we'll end up fighting over. This is at Troina. So the Germans held, you see in the distance at the very top of the screen, that's Troina. This is 1st Infantry Division's command post. And the Germans held that ridge in the front. There are more trees there at Troina today than there were in 1943. And this is a view from Enna. You saw the picture earlier where the group was kind of looking out. This is a view, okay? This is the battlefield that the Canadians and the American 1st Infantry Division is going to fight over. And you can see, and I doubt you can make it out because of the quality of the screen, you can see all the way to Mount Etna, which is 70 miles away. There. So we've had soldiers when we've traveled around these battlefields, especially some of them just come back from Afghanistan, say, I feel like there are people watching me. Because you can see so far, the line of sight for calling in artillery and whatnot was long. It's another view of Troina. This is along the north coast, which is where the 3rd Infantry Division and 45th Infantry Divisions will operate, kind of looking at it from the German side. There was one road that had to be open where the red arrow is right there. That's the sustainment for an entire corps of American troops. So we're talking about half of the U.S. Army is being sustained over one road, overwatched from the interior by mountains, ridges that extend out from a central mountain spine. It's the Coriana Valley along the north coast. I don't know how well that's coming out for you. We had to attack across things like that. They blew the bridge, and in order to clear the bridge, you have to take the ridge on the other side. Difficult terrain, which made this an engineer's war. There's a famous, the photograph up here on the right is of a famous sky bridge. That is that one main line of supply for 2 divisions that are moving along the North Coast Road. The Germans have blown out the road, and the engineers are constructing it. And that road then, and there's still vestiges of it left, is about as wide as from here to here. You can barely fit 2 trucks going backwards and forwards on it. And if you don't open that up, you can't actually move forward because you can't supply the troops. In the interior, so why can't we go off-road? Well, we did. And what we discovered was that we needed mules to do so. The photograph on the top is of the 3rd Infantry Division. Lucian Truscott's in charge of that division. He'll later be an Army commander, and he was one of the founding officers for the U.S. Rangers. He actually kind of figured after his experience in North Africa that we were going to need mules, so he brought a mule train with him. The 1st Infantry Division will purchase one or confiscate one when they're there. The Goumiers, the French troops, Moroccan troops, bring them with them. So when you went off-road to bring your beans and bullets with you, you needed stuff like this. I mean, this is almost going back to World War I. We are a truck-bound, road-bound army. We have thousands of vehicles, and that's what it's predicated on. We had to clear the roads, and in order to clear the roads, it didn't take a genius to say, hold the high ground on either side of it, make them get out of their trucks and go up these mountains. And that's what happened over and over again. There really is going to be no quick way to break through anywhere. This photograph is of a place that a Canadian battalion scaled one evening to take a German observation post. Can you see down to the bottom of that? It's about 1,200 feet. And they had to go up the side of it. How much of your gear that you're issued do you think you can carry when you do that? One of the things we learn about fighting in this kind of terrain in Sicily is you can take those numbers that are quoted. Look how much more stuff the Americans and the British had. But the reality is, and I've read the combat after action reviews, and they say this, you can cut that by 50%. So if you were supposed to have 8 81 millimeter mortars, you carried 2, and the rest of the crews are supporting it because you had to get out and you had to walk up these things. And the same is true of machine guns and other things. There are examples of battalions going into combat, and half their combat power is dedicated to sustaining the battalion when it moves forward. So sometimes numbers lie, and here they do, because the Germans and the Italians got to script. They got to determine where they fought, and they didn't need to do that because they weren't fighting in the advance other than the first phase. It's another view. This is along the Canadian main line of advance right here. Not pleasant terrain. I don't know how well you can see that. Another view on, one thing going to Sicily will bear out for you if you drive around the battlefield is that the U.S., if you watch the movie Patton, the depiction is that the Americans and the British didn't cooperate, right? Or the Commonwealth troops didn't cooperate. There are really only 3 ways to take the island, and I'll pull up a slide a little bit later and talk to you about that. But when you go to the island, this is from the Canadian main line of advance, looking over into the U.S. zone. And as I've dug into those sources, what you find is that there are examples of Canadian troops in the British 8th Army firing artillery in support of American troops. They're advancing because U.S. artillery isn't close enough. And there are examples of American troops when the Canadians are engaged right along that inter-army border firing across. And one of the most difficult things to coordinate is joint coalition fires today, is getting someone who isn't in your army to shoot indirect fire on a target to support you as you're moving forward. And we're doing that in Sicily, and it doesn't get written about in either the U.S. or the Canadian official histories, although that's stuck sometimes down in a footnote. Oh, the road net. And I'll speak to you briefly about the 3 ways you can get to Messina, other than by going by ocean. Okay? You can go along the north coast. There is a road up there. I showed you some photographs of that. The other one is the main plan was for the British to move up through the town of Catania just beneath Mount Etna and then go up that way. It's the most direct attack route. And the other 3rd way is to go to the north side of Mount Etna. So there are 3 roads that kind of lead to Messina. So the whole island isn't going to be open to you. You're really going to be bound up on doing that. So when we talk about the Allies having so many more resources than the Germans and the Italians, one thing to remember is it didn't take a genius to look at that map and put their finger in 3 places and say, these are the areas we need to defend. So you could concentrate your forces there. There isn't room to maneuver. Well, the Italian-German alliance doesn't work out too well. The Italians nominally are in charge because it's their home country. The commander's a guy named Guccione, 6th Italian Army. Very quickly, what ends up happening is that the Germans kind of shove him aside and begin to take charge of combat operations. Eventually, he'll be sent back into Italy. And this fellow right here, a guy named Hans von Hube, will be put in charge. And he'll largely take over, along with Albert Kesselring, who's back in Italy, combat operations on Sicily. So how well do you think that's going to be received? If one of the goals is to maintain the coalition, this is guaranteed not to do it. You also have a ton of examples of Italian troops not being told when the Germans are pulling back, and that's on the ground. What's going to be the reaction of that as well? How hard are you going to fight if your allies are taking your trucks and also pulling back as well? So we see signs of stress even before Mussolini is going to be removed from power. We'll page forward and get a little bit into it. One of the things I want to talk to you about is I'll just talk briefly about the invasion in the American sector on July the 10th. What ends up happening is the Germans' plan is to attack in the central area, a place called Gela, German and Italian, which is where the U.S. 1st Infantry Division is going to land. And they land there because it's an open plain. I'll show you a photograph in a second. The plan is for a mobile Italian division and a mobile German division, the Hermann Göring and the Livorno divisions, to attack together and crush the center part of whoever lands there. The problem is on day one that the German division doesn't show up on the Gela plain. And one of the reasons for that is there's bad staff work. This division has been reconstituted. But when we talk about how the German operations on the island are brilliant, the only folks who attack the Americans on day one of the landing are Italians. How does that measure up with the perception of Italian military effectiveness? They actually get in and fight. Italian tanks are driving around in the town of Gela as Rangers or American Rangers are dropping satchel charges on top of them. And so what I would suggest to you is it depends on which Italian units you're talking about. The Germans do show up on day two. It's a dramatic story. It involves, I think, an entire chapter of Carlo D'Esti's book. They get within sight of the beach with their tanks, and they are pushed back. But they have many of the same problems in coordinating their attack that the Americans and the British will have when they're moving in the inland. When they're on the offensive, neither the Italians or the Germans do very well. The reason the attack occurs here is because I think you can see in this photograph, the Gela plain is flat and open. Talk to you about two more things, I think. Keep this and we'll get to question time. One thing is, when we get to this issue of the coalition being the center of gravity, is the issue of a shift in boundaries. You know from the movie Patton that the Americans flow to the west and go into Palermo. The initial plan had the Americans driving due north right next to the British, with the British as the main effort. And there's a shift in boundary that occurs. Okay? That's the original plan. That the British 8th Army will drive on that side and American 7th Army will protect its flank moving in. In other words, a power drive to the north on the road to Messina. But the Germans are able to actually fight very well, along with some of their Italian allies, and hold up Montgomery's advance. So that's the original plan. Something that looks like that. Now, what happens is that the boundary is shifted to the west. I'll talk briefly to you about why that is. One reason for that is Montgomery looks at this and goes, there are a lot of Germans in front of me. There's an urban area, Catania, right there. They've decided, the Germans, that this is the biggest threat to us on the island. What should I do? Well, they're not going to let them break through there. And Montgomery sees an opportunity to outflank or move around the German positions. At the time, the Americans are still engaged with elements of German and Italian units in front of them. And what he does is he flies over and talks with General Alexander and says, I'd like for you to move the boundary. Alexander doesn't tell the Americans that he's going to do that. And he moves the boundary and we get the order, which causes us to get rather angry. Okay? Because our conception of this is, what do we do now? And that's what leads, and it has a really big effect on the direction that the campaign will take. Because you can see the effect of the boundary. If you look where the red is, that's where the British forces are operating, and where the green is. And we kind of get pushed out to the west. Now, the problem with that is that we won't initially be heavily engaged with them. It's going to be the British and whatnot that are. And we'll page forward to. All right, there's some photographs. Well, let me just speak to you about this, and I'll kind of conclude. There's more to talk about. Much is made in the books about letting the Germans escape. This is a photograph I took the last time I was in Sicily, and I don't know if you can make out, that's an American submarine in the center of the photograph. You see it? And you know, if this were a higher res, you can actually make out individual buildings on the other side of this. This is point-blank range for even field artillery. And the Germans created an environment, along with some Italian guns, there at the Straits of Messina that was the heaviest defended anti-aircraft environment in the world at the time. Many say we could have cut them off, and we could have used sea to do that. I will tell you that there were no assault-trained divisions available to do an invasion into the boot of Italy, so we didn't have the resources. We know that we're going to invade at Salerno later on, and we can't afford to use one landing craft. This is not the ocean, this is a river. And imagine trying to stop all river traffic across the Missouri for a 20-mile stretch. What kind of resources would that take? You can't do it if it's defended with air, and you can't do it if it's defended with Navy as well. Anybody here been a sailor? I mean, most sailors, when they see that, think of running aground. Because if you're hit there and you're damaged, you get sunk. So sailing into that is not really going to be an option if there's so many heavy guns on either side of it. And the question then would be, so what? Most folks look at this and go, those Germans who got off the island will confront them later on in Italy, and it contributes to this quagmire that Italy became and we fight through in 1944 and 45. And there are certainly German soldiers who escaped that will be shooting at us later on. I will tell you, though, that there's really only one unit that isn't essentially kind of knocked out, and that's the 29th Panzer Grenadiers. The better question, I think, is who met their goals and linked the strategic, operation, and tactical together. And I won't read this to you, but what I will tell you is this. This is often quoted from in various books, and here's what it essentially says. It says that we suffered a tactical defeat in Italy. This is written by the German commander, but we gained, it was a strategic victory. If you look at line number 1 up there, because it's selectively quoted, the main idea to describe the battles in Sicily as a success. This is a propaganda piece. It later shows up on Radio Berlin. But what we quote from it saying, here was the Germans' take on what happened. No, they're pitching how to pitch their loss. I can pull this back up for you later if you'd like. So, and I am ending now. Who met their goals? Operation Kursk gets called off, in part because the Germans began to move resources to respond to what's going on in the southern Mediterranean. Italy, Mussolini's removed. The Mediterranean sea lines of communication are open. The home front, we won something, right? We're doing things for that sacrifice that you confront. And finally, I'd say the coalition emerges stronger as a result of it. Is it a bitter victory? Could it have been greater? Certainly. But I would say this to you. When you meet all of your goals at the beginning of it, maybe we should remember that as well. And we're done. I would ask you to just remember that as well. I'm done.